Respected faculty members, distinguished audience, Assalamu alaikum, good morning. Thank you for inviting me, and truly it's a pleasure to be here to be part of this very important conversation. I'm just going to give you a brief intro to let you know who I am and why I am here today and why I speak about this subject with so much passion. I started my climate journey about 20 years ago, and it was triggered by my quest for adventure that took me to the base camp of K2. And I have trekked almost on all the mountain ranges in Pakistan and some outside the country as well. So I have a very close relationship with nature. But it was the wilderness of the mountains and the glaciers. And that is why I was delighted to see that image right behind me of snow and glaciers, because that reminds me of my beginnings, of why I became interested. And it was this deep interaction which exposed me to the power of nature, to the beauty of nature, to the degradation of the environment, and finally to the plight of the communities that live in these high mountain areas. And that is where I began my journey. Today, I had two organizations. One is Mountain and Glacier Protection Organization, and I work at the grassroots level with communities, helping to strengthen their adaptive resilience. And the other one is the Civil Society Coalition for Climate Change, where I deal more with advocacy and deal with public policy analysts and attend seminars and conferences and COPs. So that is the sort of background that I bring with me when I speak about this subject. Today, I've been asked by Saqib to talk about climate change, looking at it through the lens of gender. So I'm going to take a different take on this slightly and share with you why I think we need to look at this a little differently than we have done so far. I think we need to question fundamentally the reason of vulnerability. It's very easy for us to stand anywhere and say Pakistan is a vulnerable country, and within that, women are vulnerable in Pakistan. But why are these women vulnerable? Of course, we know that there are vulnerabilities because as a woman, you have slightly different needs, your emotional health, your way of thinking, your coping capacity, perhaps, or your physical attributes require certain different conditions. But that does not make you a victim. And the way we present women is really like victims, and I am not very happy with the image that we present. So I in my presentation today, I'm going to keep coming back to that theme of women were not born vulnerable, women have been made vulnerable by society, and climate change is only exaggerating and amplifying that vulnerability over here. Rafi already talked about the floods, and every time there's a disaster, we talk about how it impacts women differently. And we also know that in floods 2022, it affected a lot of women. And we also know that the recent floods that we have affected a lot of women. But again, I would like to question, I think in one of the presentations I saw about Bangladesh and early girl-child marriages, etc. But what is really the role of journalism? Is it just to report a disaster, or is it really to, at that time, dive a little bit deeper to see what other associated issues stem from that vulnerability or that crisis, and where are women placed in all of this? So, for example, if you have high fertility, then you also have an increase in your population. And that is another factor that we don't think about in Pakistan, of women and their lack of knowledge about reproductive health, for example. And that is why we have a set of other problems as well related to that. Also, when it comes to women, we really don't have disaggregated data available to us in the way that can actually help us in then going back, learning lessons, and doing something to do things differently. At the heart of the matter, I think, is the gender inequality status that we have in our country. We talk about equity, we talk about equitable distribution, we talk about climate justice, but rarely do we talk about social justice at home. And this is where I think the fundamental problem is right here, that we do not give women equal access or opportunity to resources. We do not empower them. We do not let them make independent decisions. And therefore, when it comes to climate change or any other crisis, you will find that they will be in a weaker position. So, we are talking about climate change, and of course, we must relate to what happens to women when there is a climate change related disaster. But I think let's look beyond that as well. And for journalism, I think it's very important to narrate other stories about women where they are vulnerable even without climate change. So, when climate change becomes an added factor, it just amplifies that existing vulnerability, because in the social spaces, in the political spaces, in the society that we live in, if viewed from outside and we look at our listing, our ranking is very low. We are at the bottom of the gender parity index. So when you're already at the bottom, of course you will have a heavier price to pay when there is a disaster or a calamity. Also, I think we need to look at the geography of Pakistan. It is varied, it has vast topographical variations in it, from the high mountains to the coastal areas. And every community has its own socio cultural and economic constraints and challenges within which these women live. So, again, when we are making that policy, Rafe just talked about that every province has a policy. I'm not really sure if every province should have its own policy. We have a national policy, and that should be the overarching policy. Everything under that should be a framework of actions, the activity plan of what provinces need to do. Otherwise, everyone is taking off on a tangent on their own, and there is no convergence that brings the national policy into play. So here we come a little bit into the power of storytelling. How should you tell that story? Should you just report a disaster and should you just show how a woman is suffering? Or should you show two parallel lives to show if that woman was empowered, educated, and had the economic independence? Would she have coped better with that disaster? Would she have made different choices about her own life, about her family size, about where to live, about how much to save? I think these stories need to go deeper. And every time you tell a story about a woman, it should not be to show the face of her vulnerability, but the lack of that empowerment that has made her vulnerable. I think that is very, very important. Sometimes, foreign TV channels pick up certain stories like about this woman, Seema Chandio, and she is just, when, my team was putting this presentation together, I was questioning them and I was saying, what gives you the image of empowerment of this woman? She's standing there and a man is again handing a brick to her and she's just laying that brick. But nevertheless, that made it to the headlines, and that must have made that woman feel good, and probably it will encourage other women. And I think that's the sort of thing that we need to do more often. I told you about the work that I do with mountain communities. I've been engaged with them for about 20 years. Now, I know full well that our putting that condition that when you make a community organization, it must have 40% representation of women doesn't mean that 40% have become decision makers. But the mere fact that they have a seat on the table, after 20 years, I see that there's a change in their stance. They now know that these men need us to be in the forefront. These women who are not allowed to interact with us, not allowed to sit with us, not allowed to share what they really want with from us, now have to be in the lead. So they have to put the women in the front. And these are the sort of subtle changes after a certain period of time when the newer generation comes forward. They start understanding that they matter, their voice matters, and then they come forward and they seize their own space in society. So I think it's very, very important that we come out with these narratives and stories using climate as the pivot to shift the way people think of women and about women. Now, policy and communication seen through the gender lens is very important. Policies are made in a way which are too technical. And here I myself am committing that cardinal sin. I'm speaking to you in English, and every conversation that we have about climate is also in English, but we forget that the majority do not speak this language. Within the country, it's not even Urdu that they understand. If you go into the remote regions, it is their own provincial languages that they speak. Where are those messages? So, if it cannot be in writing, then communication and journalism using the digital tools that we have can, I think, take assistance from audio visual aids to come up with short stories, effective messaging that these women can see. And if the older cohort cannot, because when I speak with women in the rural communities where we work, I find that those above 40 are more or less resigned to their fate. They feel that there can be no change. But the younger ones do feel they have a different aspiration for themselves in the future. So I think stories, for example, when you're showing a woman who is carrying firewood or who's carting water down the hill or who's working in the field, you can also show that the same woman is not allowed to open a bank account, because that is, the challenge that I face with the communities where I work. When I tell them, all right, we monetize their labor, we pay them these wages, open their own independent bank accounts, they're very reluctant. So you can show that they let her go in the jungle alone, walk hours,